Everybody. Thank you for joining us for the Future of Democracy lecture series. My name is Beth Simone Novak. I'm a professor at New York University and a senior fellow at the Institute for Public Knowledge and director of the Governance Lab, which together with IPK sponsors this series that we run and have been running for the last 2 years. I think a topic that is no more important ever before as it is now, which is to focus on the future of our democracy. Not so much to dwell on the problems and the challenges, which are all too apparent, but to really try to imagine what is the kind of future that we want to create. And so, of course, on January 6th, a systematic, relentless campaign of grievance and falsehood led by President Trump and stoked by members of the Republican Party and Congress and the right-wing media culminated in the violent attack on the Capitol that we all watched unfold. The really incompetently planned, but nonetheless highly deadly coup attempt counted among its leaders, of course, white supremacists and neo-Nazis and devotees of the paranoid conspiracy theory QAnon. Yet what's perhaps even more troubling is that support among Americans for the insurrection went way past just that right-wing fringe. According to YouGov, about 45% of Republicans said they actually backed the coup. And of course, 74 million Americans voted for Trump in 2020, despite his undisguised contempt for democratic institutions and democratic decision-making, both during the campaign and over 4 years of his presidency. So watching those events unfold, one could be forgiven for really thinking that in fact, the future of democracy is very far away and that in fact, American democracy was reaching its final hours. But of course, consistent with the theme of our series, we've invited 2 people to join us here today to have a conversation about why I would argue, and I think we'll hear from them, that's not so. And to talk with them about what does lie in store for us and about how we can turn more power over to ordinary people, transforming how we govern and strengthening our democracy. So I'm delighted today that we can talk with Maurice Mo Mitchell, National Director of the Working Families Party and a leader in the movement for Black Lives, and author and Columbia lecturer and New America Fellow Holly Rusin Gilman in a conversation today about the future of democracy. I'm going to, for your benefit, put their bios, which you've all seen, which drew you here today. I'll put those in the chat for people who want to catch up. And we're going to be talking about this question of where do we go from here, especially after January 6th. So we're going to start our conversation with our current political moment, but we're going to try to spend most of our discussion focused on the future that you are trying to build and your vision for the future of our democracy and our political institutions. So with Trump just barely in the rearview mirror, but in the rear view, we hope, but with COVID and recession and climate change and systemic racism still very front and center, we want to focus today on what the future is for democratic activism and engagement in this time of crisis, and where do we go from here? For those of you who want to ask questions, whether about the future of democracy or about the political questions that I'm sure you're itching to ask, you can put those in the Q&A and we'll be turning to your questions shortly. And for those, of course, who would like it, there is closed captioning. You can push the closed caption button at the bottom of your screen in order to see a transcript of the discussion for those who may be hearing impaired and need the extra visual prompts. But please, by all means, you can use the Q&A to ask your questions all along, and I will exercise moderator's prerogative to start our discussion and ask you, Mo and Holly, first to start with the problems as you diagnose them. Obviously, they're myriad, and before we talk about how to fix our democracy, I want to ask you what you each perceive to be the root causes of the failures of our democracy today. Welcome, and Holly, let me start with you.
All right, great. Well, thank you so much for having me. It's an honor and a delight to be here with 2 people who I respect and admire so much, talking about this, this very simple topic about rebuilding our democracy. So I will obviously caveat by saying, my views are definitely evolving on this situation, and I really look forward to learning from both of you and to learning from the audience. So, I'll offer some of my assessments, and then Mo, I'm very curious, your thoughts, and Beth as well. So there's a lot of ways to think about this sort of problem of how we got here and what is, the failures of our democracy. So I'll just sort of say a few root causes. I think the first one is definitely systemic racism. It's clear that we've never really had a multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy in this country, and racism is the cause of that. And we've seen the cracks of our institutions in this last year across a variety of ways, and a real lack of power, both in the civic sector, but also in our political institutions. And so if we're really going to envision what a democracy, for the people, by the people, and really all the people, it's a radical concept, and it's something that we've never seen. But hopefully this is the moment when we can have a little bit, we can actually see that vision. And I think another challenge we see right now is sort of the brittle institutions. So our institutions of governance have not evolved in the way that our society has evolved. And you see this on, the filibuster, dependency in the two-party system, and Mo, excited to get your thoughts on all of this. You see this in the sort of tragedy of our health outcomes and how our political inequality is really linked to our economic inequality. And you've seen sort of the toll that this has taken, particularly in Black and Brown communities this past year. And I think finally, the sort of focus on technocratic expertise has really led to some of this erosion of our institutions. Putting too much emphasis on elites, on those with connections to sort of run things, and not thinking about how we genuinely create participatory mechanisms for governance. I'll stop there, and there's sure a lot more to say.
Mo, over to you.
Great, thank you. And just thanks for the opportunity to be in conversation, and really looking forward to hearing from both of you on this very rich and timely topic. So the way I see it, the last 4 years, the events of the last few months and the events of January 6th, as horrible as they were and violent and as imperiled as our democracy is, I actually think that one of the benefits of all of us witnessing what took place is that we could disabuse ourselves of this idea of American exceptionalism, right? Which I think really limits our ability to be able to assess the problem. If we just assume that America's great simply because we're great, and that our institutions are somehow the best simply because we're us, it's really hard to have a sober and clear-eyed assessment of the conditions, and it's really hard to prescribe any solutions. So just the mere fact that all of us witnessed what we witnessed, I think gives us an opportunity broadly to have a popular conversation about how we want to reimagine our society, in a conversation that's not just in the academy, but like a very popular conversation with everyday people around. What is it that we're trying to do here? And how is it that we're trying to govern ourselves? So yeah, I think there's a number of factors that are creating what we're experiencing in our economy, but we can't talk about what's happening today without contextualizing it in the past 40 years. The neoliberal era, I think, has led to a hastening of the corporate capture of our political system. And the solution to that is both a democratic society and a democratic economy. The corporate capture of our political system means more public corruption, us becoming sort of more comfortable with public corruption, and it's a cycle. The more that corporate actors and the very wealthy have a oversized impact on how we're governed, the direction of our democracy, the more they're able to further erode the structures of our democracy, so that our government and our democracy tend towards the already privileged, and to privilege the already privileged while ensuring that the downside of decisions sort of hurt the already disenfranchised and marginal. And that cycle will come to a head. I think January 6th is a moment that is, I think, in some ways, we probably couldn't have seen that particular moment, but we can't be surprised that we experience political violence when, the basic structures of our democracy have been whittled down to the point where everyday citizens can't really access it. This is one of the reasons why far-right populists have been able to organize in the way that they've been able to. they could very convincingly say that the system doesn't work, that the democracy doesn't work, that the economy is rigged. And then from there, speak very convincingly about who the villains are: immigrants, Mexicans, Black folks, transgender people. So there's an interrelation between the inability of the democracy to function and the ability of far-right ideologues, white nationalists, and others to organize. And similar to and folks could do math. The demography is clear, right? The grievance, the concern about racial annihilation that these white nationalists have, it leads to a natural sort of conclusion where they have to give up on democracy itself and commit to political violence and commit to sort of supporting apartheid measures, like all of the state by state, all of the regimes, to make it very, very hard for everyday people to organize their vote or organize through unions and organizations to be able to advance their will. So all of these things are interconnected. I think the future, if we want to develop a true democracy, a multiracial democracy, we need to democratize our economic system as well as our political system, because you can't have a democratic society without a democratic economy. And we need to focus on the very structures, the fundamental structures of our democracy. And everything has to be scrutinized, from the Senate to the two parties, the rigid two-party system, to the electoral college. All of these things have to be scrutinized, to the filibuster rule. And when we look at some of these things historically, we understand that many of these things were put in place historically for the very purpose of preventing a multiracial alignment of forces on the grassroots level to be able to manifest their will. So I think this is the perfect time to have some very deep questions about the very fundamentals of our democracy and be able to reimagine what a grassroots, multiracial, broad-based democracy could look like in this country.
Obviously, as you've pointed out, both of you have pointed out, there are so many intertwined root causes here. And I'm just curious if there is a wrong way or a right way in. I mean, in a day and age when we have, 50 years of stagnant wages, declining life expectancy, rampant disinformation, and all of these other things that are driving what we see as the challenges. You've pointed both very much to the twin challenges of outdated institutions and at the same time, unrepentant, unconfronted white supremacy, and that we've never dealt with. Is there in terms of untangling this ball, is there a right way or a wrong way into this from your perspective? In other words, Mo, you've pushed a lot on the issues of institutional corruption, of institutionalized sort of capitalist values, for lack of a bit, left unchecked, and seem to suggest that if we go at it through the economic, we will achieve the multiracial governance that we're seeking. Holly, what I'm hearing from you a little bit is that we really have to confront the issues of race and society first in order to then get to the economic issues. Is that a fair statement, or is there a right or a wrong way to attack this?
Well, if I could respond first, I mean, I think it's essential you kind of have to do both. You have to be able to view things holistically, and to use a now almost cliche term, to have an intersectional analysis where you could sort of view these systems from the race, class, and gender sort of perspective, and have a race, class, and gender analysis of the problem and the solutions. So yeah, absolutely, economic justice without racial justice is hollow, and racial justice without economic justice is hollow. Which is why, I talk about a multiracial democracy. I do, as an organizer, I do think you meet people where they're at. So I would say there's no quote unquote wrong point of entry to have this conversation. But once you're in the conversation, I think it's really important that you deepen it, and that you don't narrowly sort of think that you could solve a multifaceted problem from a narrow approach. So I often talk about public corruption and the economy because oftentimes because of my work in the movement for Black Lives, you know, folks like to engage racial justice from the narrow standpoint of criminal justice and policing. And what I try to explain is like, look, all of this stuff is the same thing. There's no way you could achieve racial justice if in a country where oftentimes Black unemployment is twice that of white unemployment, we don't address economic justice. So I think it's nuanced, but I would say like as an organizer, any any sort of jumping off point is a fair and good one, as long as we pivot to having a more sort of nuanced, multi-layered approach to understanding the problem.
I think that's really interesting. You know, I think the only thing I would sort of yes and is sort of, and Beth, you sort of mentioned the misinformation, just like how do we also, this is not detangling, but adding another piece to this puzzle, and that is sort of the role of private platforms, you know, thinking about the sort of unchecked power of these tech companies and the sort of uneasy relationship that I think a lot of people have about the ability that Twitter had to really magnify President Trump's tweets, you know, thinking of like the great organizing from Color of Change and GLAAD and other groups to try to take that down, but then sort of thinking about, well, what does that mean for the future of our democracy? And so, you know, I'm sort of the view that, you know, these are not public spaces, but so maybe we need public digital spaces, and maybe that's really a part of it. And thinking about what sort of pro-social, pro-civic, well-moderated, a la, you know, Front Porch Forum in Vermont, where 2/3 of Vermonters are on, but it's heavily moderated space, what that would look like. I think that needs to be a part of this equation. And for me, you know, I loved, Mo, what you were saying about thinking about these structural changes. When I look at like an intervention, you know, I've spent a lot of time studying participatory budgeting. Okay, so now how do we elevate that to have a broader conversation about participatory economic democracy? It doesn't mean that we don't want to focus on the intervention, but it means we have to tie it up to these larger structural questions of how money is allocated, how people have a say in it. And it's kind of toggling between the sort of micro and the macro and going back and forth until we can kind of, you know, gain momentum and then ultimately build for some of these structural changes.
So you're moving us nicely forward into, we could dwell on the problems all day. I have, you know, an endless list of questions, but again, we're here to hear about your vision for the future. You each have a foot in the world of politics, in the world of activism, and I'm curious whether you see the what you see as being the ways forward here. If these are failures of politics or of governance, and if we can talk about what the ground game looks like in both of these domains. So maybe starting a little bit with the political, and not that, again, you can't disentangle these things. But curious, and I'll start with Mo here, obviously, what the political ground game looks like and what we can do to create new models for politics, what those
Sure.
look like, what's happening in the field that's exciting and hopeful from your perspective. And we'll move on to talking a little bit more about governance as well in a moment.
Great. There's so much to be excited about in the realm of politics. And I would take it all the way back. I don't know if folks remember, but there used to be a time when people would heavily critique the US sort of social movements and, you know, look to other countries. Like folks would say like, oh, in Paris, there's a protest or mobilization every single day on every single issue. And we're so complacent. But I really think that there's been a shift in the political DNA in this country, starting probably from Occupy, from, you know, Occupy Wall Street to the Movement for Black Lives, to the immigrant rights movement, to the Women's March and the resistance against Trump, that popularly, on a very grassroots level, people are seeing themselves as political protagonists, and people are seeing themselves as political agents. And this is a good thing for having a robust civil society, that individuals are not looking for permission. Individuals are running in insurgent races. These are everyday working class people all across this country, running on the hyper local level, you know, from town boards to water boards to Congress. You know, most famously AOC, but, you know, putting aside her and her meteoric rise and her really unique way that she uses her platform in order to be able to bring in the larger story. There are many candidates folks like Cori Bush, who came from the protest lines in St. Louis and Ferguson, somebody like Jamal Bowman, who was an educator, somebody like Kendra Brooks, who was a grassroots organizer and now is an independent Working Families Party city council person in Philly. And there's dozens and dozens of stories of people in the last few years who have chose to make these interventions and and done the impossible. It's not easy to run against incumbents. It's not easy to run against political machines, but there's a growing grassroots sort of movement of individuals who are providing $5, $10, $25 small dollar donations, supporting these grassroots candidates. And there's almost a formula of grassroots candidates that are generally coming from identities and experiences that often aren't seen in public office. They are running unapologetically on their experience and story, and running unapologetically as true progressives. And they're able to build movements around them. And then when they're elected, those movements continue to flank them. So that's to me, a very exciting development in our politics. And I think that's only going to continue. There's only more momentum around it. And, of course, that's our bread and butter at Working Families. We endorse more than 1,000 candidates around the country and work very deeply with dozens and dozens of candidates, and being able to develop the trajectory from private citizen, working person, somebody who's relatively obscure, to elected official. And once they're in office, then they're accountable to other interests. And there's a different sort of incentive structure for somebody who didn't have to kiss any rings in order to get elected, didn't have to make any deals, didn't have to dial for dollars with large donors or corporate interest. And once they're in office, they could truly be independent and ultimately accountable to their constituents. So those developments, I think, are fundamentally small d democratic, and I think moves our politics closer to the ground.
That's awesome. And it's really inspiring. And you named such exciting people. And it's really, I think this new generation of leadership is it does make me very hopeful. And I think kind of the governance side, I've been working closely with mayors and with city officials all around the country. And what I'm seeing is a lot of demand. They sort of really want to engage constituents in a new way. And so I think part of the opportunity, and this is something that we talk about in the book, is how do you build hooks and levers? Like, how do you build these interfaces so that people on the ground who are in the grassroots organizing community feel like their voice is being translated into policy outcomes, and that there's some kind of accountability and some kind of positive feedback loop. I mean, to me, that's kind of the big nut to crack right now. We can't just engage people for the sake of PR or another check the box exercise. We really need to think about, like, what does it look like for people to give up some of their decision-making authority and then empower community members in a variety of ways to really have an input into how decisions are made. And I can speak a little bit more about models now or kind of later, whatever works.
All of the above. I just want to draw out this distinction between this question of what the policies are and what the politics are, and a whole series of progressive issues, obviously, like defunding the police and worker rights and worker voice, consumer protection, and the how we do the politics and how we govern ourselves. And I think that's really where, in addition to a whole set of progressive issues and progressive candidates that you're talking about, I'm really eager to hear you guys talk more about the how we do things differently, and what is really working on what's working on the ground. So I think we should dive in here and see if there are alternatives, if there are different ways we can, Mo, you've already talked a little bit about how we're getting people elected and the small donations. What else you're seeing in terms of this crossover between the activism, where people have real power in terms of their voice, and the politics?
Well, yeah, I mean, I want to drill down. I'll give one example, and hopefully that example could tell a story about how we could apply that in multiple contexts. So when you look at the Philly municipal race in 2019, now I won't get too in the weeds, but in certain municipalities, there's set aside city council seats for the minority party, right? Now in places like Philly where like Democrats basically run the board, the minority party is almost always the Republican Party. What that essentially means is that Republicans just get a few seats on the city council simply for breathing, right? Effectively, it means Republicans are always represented, even in the most democratic cities where this law exists. So the Working Families Party reasoned that there wasn't very much support for Republicans at all for the party of Trump in Philadelphia, and the Working Families Party could actually engage in a struggle against the Republican Party to be the minority party in Philly. That was the theory behind Kendra Brooks and Nicholas O'Rourke's race. They came together and they built a coalition that included labor organizations. It included new grassroots organizations that had come about over the past few years. Grassroots organizations that came about in order to support Bernie Sanders' race and Elizabeth Warren's race. Grassroots organizations that were community-based organizations. And they built a really impressive coalition that was multiracial, that was multi-issue, that was multi-sector, and they were able to raise a significant amount of small dollar donations. They raised more than $1 million to run this race. And additionally, there were institutions like labor unions and the Working Families Party that ran an independent effort side by side with them. And we used our own independent resources, and the labor organizations from Labor Dues built a political war chest behind Nick and Kendra. And the combined power of those two things were able to defeat the political establishment. Both Democrats and Republicans were not pleased with this. They had basically had they had effectively had a truce, right? They agreed that, look, we'll allow, 2 Republicans to be on the city council. And that was basically the truce. We disrupted the truce. And now there's an independent city council person, at large city council person in Philadelphia. Why I tell that story is that you could replicate that in many places, right? You could replicate that type of grassroots sort of electioneering that isn't the typical sort of party boss coronation. And it starts with authentic candidates who have proven that they're committed to causes and issues and movements. Like Kendra is a resident of Nicetown all her life, on the front lines of educational equity, on the front lines of the movement for Black lives. Nicholas on the front line of movement for Black lives in the ministry. And it's issue forward. So it's not based on their personalities, it's based on a slate of issues that brings together this pretty broad and diverse grouping of unions and grassroots organizations and activists and political actors who see the candidacy as a venue for their politics, not simply the coronation of the political personalities. And I think that that's a different, the DNA of American politics is it's very much personality focused. It's like an individual decides one day, I think I should run. And then from there, they get consultants. And then from there, their consultants figure out the issues and then they build a base. This is actually the opposite. We start from a base, and a base democratically develops a set of issues and a platform. And then we choose candidates to be the vehicles for that platform. And then after the election, we stay engaged. I think that is a flipping of the traditional American politicking that we're really interested in.
Let's go over to you, Holly. And really excited to hear about some of the models. I put it in the chat, but I'll just flag for everybody Holly's new book, with Civic Power, Rebuilding American Democracy in an Era of Crisis, in which you talk about a lot of these hopeful models. So share with us some of what you're seeing.
Thank you. Well, I love that story, Mo, because it really talks about sort of institutionalizing power, but sort of how you have to also know the rules of the game. Like it takes this sort of institutional knowledge and then sort of using it to kind of bring sort of civic power to the fore. So I really like that example. I mean, for a variety of reasons, but it's sort of interesting to me, and I will get to the question that you asked, Beth, but just sort of thinking about the first thing you asked us, right? And it's sort of how do we also learn about what's wrong with these institutions so that we can exploit them for change, for like lack of a better term. And so I think that's kind of an interesting takeaway for me from this conversation. You know, a lot of the stuff that I've been looking at is thinking about, you know, both how you bring, you know, new leadership and how you kind of organize in that way, but then how you can create some of these, you know, more resilient models for governance. So I'll give a few examples. You know, one of the ones that I have been really interested in is the Office of Community Wealth Building in Richmond, Virginia. Started in 2014. And it was essentially an initiative that said, you know, here we are, we're trying to do poverty reduction policy, and we don't ever talk to people who are actually experiencing poverty. And so out of that kind of simple realization came a really powerful structure for empowering people who are on the receiving end of benefits to have a much more direct say in how policy gets done, and in a way that actually has teeth, right? Actually having an input in the decision making early on, not just sort of at the end, not just rubber stamping things, but actually having input when it matters. And that kind of goes full circle to this knowing how the process works is really important, and then figuring out where is the right place for resident input, and then having an ongoing relationship. So that's one of the things that I love about this office in Richmond is that, you know, now they have open office hours every Friday, and they've actually built real relationships with people in the community, and community members feel like their voice is heard. It doesn't mean that everything happens the way people would want it, but there's some kind of back and forth transparency about what's possible and what's not. And I think that relationship is really important too. But again, kind of coming full circle, it requires trust. It requires the people in power to be willing to give up a little bit of their authority. And it requires sort of creating those mechanisms for kind of embedding this change and this process into decision making.
Are you hopeful about the prospects for that? Do you see, for example, the murder of George Floyd and the movement for Black Lives and the protests of the last year being a reason we're likely to see more transition to greater power sharing? Or what are we going to do to wrest this control?
Well, you know, as somebody who was instrumental in building the movement for Black Lives, I just have to say, like, the events of last year felt like a vindication of our politics and the ideas that we had been developing and organizing on the grassroots level for years. And the movement for Black Lives is now like the largest protest movement in American history. And I do believe that there's a dialectical relationship, right? It's like the movement for Black Lives and this sort of reckoning around white supremacy and anti-Black violence for most of the summer. And, you know, then this white supremacist coup in January 6th, there's a relationship there. I am ultimately hopeful because the movement surfaced people in every single state, and it was a Black-led, Black-focused, multiracial, multi-generational, multi-ethnic movement. And so it gives me a lot of cause for optimism. Those folks that have been surfaced, they stayed in the fight. I know because we communicated with many of them. And you know, like there was an action everywhere. There was an action in South Dakota and North Dakota. There were actions, several actions in Wyoming. These are places where there's not that many Black folks. And folks were politicized, folks were radicalized, and folks continue to engage electorally and politically, and are continue to be post the election political actors. So I think long term, the impact of the movement for Black Lives that surfaced more than 26 to 27 million people in the streets are hard to even process or understand. But I think we'll be feeling the impact of it for many, many years. That's the same thing we saw after Ferguson and the initial movement for Black Lives wave. Many of those people who hit the streets founded organizations. Some of those people are now elected officials. And so I'm really excited to see what this particular movement wave, which was exponentially larger than the first one, how it will continue to shape our politics. But I have a lot of optimism around that.
We have a question in the Q&A, which I'm going to dig up now and to give credit where credit's due in a moment. But somebody asked about sort of this is all very hopeful, essentially. But if you're really talking about undoing some of the worst effects of capitalist excess, if we're really trying to respond to essentially a real cruelty, I would say, in our politics that has emerged, where the bottom line has mattered more than humankind. I'm just wondering whether you see the kinds of things you're talking about in Richmond, Holly, and these kinds of efforts to listen to people really being enough, and really sort of what this transition looks like. Do we really, through the protests and then through some of these civic engagement things, are we hopeful that we can truly undo the worst of capitalist excess?
I need to take that one first.
A small question, yes.
Yeah.
I defer to you, Bye-bye.
I was going to say, Mo, jump in there. You know, these are great questions, and they're heady questions. You know, one of the things that I can't, you know, just this maybe is a roundabout way to answer it, but, you know, I'm still sort of trying to process the events of January 6th. And today DHS put out an announcement about like, we should all be alert for sort of white supremacy terror in the United States. And it's kind of the first time they've done something like that on domestic terrorism. And the Biden-Harris administration has a new special assistant position on sort of domestic terror. And so, you know, as scary as that is for a variety of reasons, you know, maybe that is helpful in terms of elevating the threat of white supremacy and domestic terror in a real way where we can really gain some momentum and some traction. You know, it's just sort of this kind of combination of so many toxic forces, you know, toxic masculinity, racism, misinformation, lack of trust in institutions, systemic policing challenges. Like it kind of, you know, it hits on so many things. And so maybe if enough people are like understand and the threat is really evident to them, we can kind of move the ball forward on some of those big topics. Maybe also capitalism. I mean, since we've had this thing in the last day or two, which I don't feel like I'm an expert at all to talk about, but either of you maybe can jump in here. There's no doubt to me that sort of the health disparities, the economic disparities, and the political disparities are very interwoven, and the climate crisis as well. And so, you know, when you look at this past year, you know, I was listening to something about like, if 2020 hadn't been the year of all those other things, it would have been the year of climate. And so it's like, we have all these crises and they're obviously interwoven and there's obviously intersectionality. And so can that move the ball forward, you know, with capitalism run amok, with sort of the way that that impacts all of these other crises? Like maybe we can build off the amazing work that Mo and other organizers have done to really animate people and keep people civically engaged. You know, I often talk about our civic muscles, and we've seen so many people sort of exerting and training their muscles or whatever the right metaphor is. And I don't want us to lose that. I want us to really continue to build on that, even in these really scary and unsettling times.
Yeah,
You muted yourself right at the end there. Mo, I just want to give credit here. I'm putting the questions now in the chat. That question was asked by Takayoshi Kusago, but then Thalyan Olivo asks essentially the same question, which is what would a democratic economy look like? And is eager for you to expand on that idea. So it's just a more concise way of asking what I just said.
Sure. Well, I think that this is one of the best opportunities to answer that question in a very popular way. And I'll even, you know, sort of contextualize it in COVID and the past year. One of the advantages to us answering these questions and asking these questions in this moment is that we're all, everybody, all the people on the planet, all several billion of us, are experiencing and trying to wrestle with this global pandemic. And the global pandemic is a public health crisis, but because of the public health crisis, there are serious secondary economic impacts that are taking place globally. You put on top of that the pre-existing economic and the structural economic and racial problems that we've been facing for generations. And what it's caused is a popular examination of all of our systems. So this isn't, what generally has been the province of people in the academy, or the province of folks in philosophy, asking fundamental questions like, what is my relationship to our society? What is the nature of this economy? Everybody is essentially asking these questions. And so I actually feel very hopeful about a reexamination, a popular reexamination of the political system, a fundamental questioning of capitalism at a time when the market is doing very well. But it is objectively clear that everyday people are not doing very well. So the very indicators that we use to determine the health and the fundamentals of our economy, those are in question. The GameStop thing, I think many people have said that the essentially the stock market is a highfalutin casino. And this whole GameStop thing, I think, has shone a spotlight on the fact that a lot of this stuff is wacky. And many of the elites who lead our politics and lead our government, that, like, over the past few years, I feel like the fact of elite mediocrity has also come to the fore, right? And everyday people are questioning the folks who are supposed to lead us, and manage us and manage our economy. All of this stuff is kind of collapsing. And so this is the perfect time to question capitalism and question what is the economic system that could deal with these contradictions, and actually an economic system that could actually democratically be able to manage the commons. So what does a democratic economy look like? I think essentially a democratic economy looks like an economy where workers who produce through their labor, produce the value of our society, are have a say in the both in the decisions that govern their work, and have a say in how the profit is managed from their work. And furthermore, that workers could collectively organize, and worker power could be used in order to balance the power of institutions. I think if you have a society like that, then there's checks and balances that are put in place so that things cannot be too big to fail, that institutions can be too powerful to overcome democracy, and then also that the government is used as a tool in order to protect people and protect workers from institutions and from corporations and from the wealthy, and that there's guardrails so that no person could be so wealthy and powerful that they could, through their money, exert their will against others, and no institutions could be so big that simply because of their size that they have to, they can't be held accountable. And I think this is one of the problems with the tech monopolies. These are projects that have just grown so big that they end up in effect playing the role of some sort of public utility, but they aren't. They're private tools of individuals. And I think in a democratic society, we would have the guardrails and regulations to prevent that from happening.
I want to just flag for people that since we don't have a chat today, we only have the Q&A. If you're putting substantive comments as opposed to questions, I am answering them, which allows you to see them in the answered box. So there are a number of helpful suggestions, books, links, comments, plugs. Those are under the answered column, which everybody should be able to see now. And I know, Holly, you want to jump in here, so please do, and then I will bring in some more questions.
I love everything you said. I love sort of how do we use this COVID crisis to sort of narrow, to really laser in on the things that matter. And I think I would just sort of and to paid leave, care workers, essential workers, really thinking about what is this economy, right? And I love what you were saying, right? The stock market is soaring, but are people not the economy, right? It's what is the health of the economy if you have nearly 500,000 people who have died? Is that how we, is that a healthy economy? What are the things we value? And there's a lot of stuff that's written on this of just like how we could evaluate the health of our society beyond just GDP, beyond material wages. And so in the hopeful category, seeing more momentum around things like guaranteed income pilots. If we've seen one thing sort of through this process is that direct cash works, and it's a thing that we saw miraculously a bipartisan Congress put through. And so in sort of marrying the work I've been interested in with this moment, thinking of people's assemblies, sort of vehicles for autonomy and for building people-centric power, Newark, for example, is launching a guaranteed income pilot, and they've been working closely with the community through the People's Assembly model, which they sort of learned in Jackson, Mississippi. And to me, that's really powerful. There's a group of mayors now organizing around guaranteed income. So if we can say like these things work, right? We've had this kind of natural experiment, and I really, that does make me hopeful.
Holly, you muted yourself.
That's it.
Oh, that's it. We've solved it all.
That's the Zoom equivalent of dropping the mic.
I just dropping the mic. Pick up dead air. We have questions, things to do.
I'm going to bring you back, and there are a lot of questions in the chat about this. I want to bring you back from the what of the politics to the how of the politics. So for example, Stephen Buckley asked the question, what does Biden need to do specifically to empower citizen engagement in decision-making that affects their lives that President Obama did not do, for example, in his open government program? I think that one is, I'll take that personally. Lots of things that we didn't do. So coming back to, there was another question in here. There's a lot of stuff in here. There was a question in here about crowdsourcing, which I will find in a minute. And again, sort of more of the what we can do, how do we do things differently? So if we want to get to this future of more universal basic income pilots, or a society in which we measure value in new ways, what do we need to do institutionally? Jose Marti, for example, asked the question essentially about whether the pandemic has opened our eyes to realizing or thinking about global democracy and really creating global institutions that allow us to deal with the threats that we're facing. Is this about creating new kinds of global institutions? And I'll put that in the chat so that people can read them. But I want to bring you back to some of these how, not just the what that we need to do. Mo, we'll come back to you.
Oh, I have to jump in? Okay.
No, no. Mo, I think you just talked, so I would love to get Mo in here.
Okay.
Please jump in.
Oh,
okay,
yes,
sure.
sorry.
All right.
I did my headset.
So, so could you re-articulate it around the how? So I want to make sure that there's a lot of, I know there's a lot of
we're just coming back to the sort of, yeah, I know you're probably trying to read all the comments that are coming in. So it's just the how we can reform how we can re-engineer the plane while flying it. So
Yes.
if the destination that you've already identified for us, how do we fix the institutions? How do we reform our institutions? Or do we need to create entirely new forms of institutions to get us there?
Yeah, my answer to that is yes, right? So I think we need to, like, I generally take multifaceted approaches. I don't put all of my eggs in one basket. And we have to do a number of things at the same time. So we need to identify the proximal interventions, the things that we could do now that change people's material conditions, and also do two other things: shift the balance of power towards everyday people, and make it harder for organized capital to be able to advance this agenda. It's like, so we want to focus on the reforms that do those three things now: improve material conditions, empower people, weaken the grip of organized capital on our society, right? And as we do that, we're building people power so that we could eventually build enough power to change structures and the very institutions, so that we could have popular referendums on things, for example, in the US political system, like things like the Senate as an undemocratic institution. The Senate currently is split 50-50, but the 50 Democrats represent 41 million more people than the 50 Republicans. It's fundamentally undemocratic. like the Electoral College, which is fundamentally undemocratic, like the first past the post two-party system, which creates the spoiler dilemma, which means that independent third parties and having a multi-party democracy is not viable in this country. So all of those things, those are structural changes, and we need to build enough power and have the proximal changes to lead to those structural changes. The other thing is there's an opportunity outside of the traditional levers of power to engage in robustly. So I'm really excited about all of the mutual aid work that's happening all around us. So where government can't or won't step in and be nimble in order to support people, people and independent institutions and grassroots organizations are stepping in order to provide material relief to one another. That mutual aid sort of muscle, I think, is really critical. And what often happens is that when mutual aid sort of institutions outside of the government, when they're vibrant, it almost shames the government into reforming, right? So we saw this with the Panthers and the free lunch and the free breakfast programs. That has become a staple in our schools. And so I think there's a role for both the direct reform of institutions as well as independent outside efforts to people directly through mutual aid or other outside efforts to provide solutions. All of those things, I think, lead to the type of change that we want to see.
Holly, as you dive in to answer this, let me bring in Carl's question here, and again, a structural reform question where he's really asking the question. He says, "Is an executive order that mandates that OIRA reform the regulatory review mechanism to make government regulations more sustainable, more inclusive, and avoid capture." Sorry, for the non-Americans, that's the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs in the White House. "Do you think we can change our system of regulation to achieve these kinds of goals?" Or anything else that you want to bring in terms of how do we really institutionalize the kind of civic power mechanisms that you're talking about?
That's great. Well, I'm so happy also that you talked about mutual aid networks. That was one of the things I was thinking about too, and sort of the crowdfunding. Beth, also would love your thoughts. I know we have like 5 minutes left, but sort of how that, really played out during COVID has been really fascinating. Okay, 7 minutes. I'll hit on a few quick things. There's a lot to discuss here. So how do we do this? I think one of it is Beth, obviously jump in, sort of thinking about moving from not just releasing information, but really empowering people around it. So when we look at sort of what Taiwan did, with COVID data, really like making that data truly public in a way that puts some responsibility in the civic tech community to take ownership and to show where masks were available, to do those heat maps, right? But it kind of goes back to this trust question, right? If you don't trust the public and the public doesn't trust the government, you're not going to get there. But I think part of how we can move there is to really, empower people in these moments. And so that's kind of one example, making information not just available, but really empowered information. And the second is sort of embedding real equity lens and mechanisms into decision-making that we can't just turn the clock back on, right? And so when I look back at some of the challenges that we had in the Obama administration, I think, and I'll just speak from my own personal experience, was sort of embedding things so that they could last and not just be turned back when another administration comes into power. So I talked a little bit about participatory budgeting, but one of the things that I was looking at was how we can embed it in terms of dollars we're already giving to communities as part of community development block grants. So places where there already is a participation mechanism, okay, so we start there, and then we say we have to put a racial equity and inequality lens into that decision-making process. And then we say we have to scale it up so that it can't be taken back, and so that's, I think, how you can kind of build so that you're creating something that can last the length of time. And then finally, when we think about new leadership and, how effective, I feel like working parties, family, and all of this movement have been in sort of bringing new leaders to the fore, how do we then embed them? I've talked about something called like civic fellowships, whatever name you want, but sort of how do you create more opportunities for people to have, a stint organizing, a stint in local government, a stint in philanthropy? Just that's one example. Could be kind of any different, configuration of it, but the idea is to try to get more diverse expertise, get out of this sort of reliance on unpaid internships, which really privilege a certain group of people, get out of this system where the sort of barriers to be leaders are so high, and thinking about how you do that in a way where you have sort of mentorship and you have sort of varied opportunities to sort of stay engaged. And to the ORA question, well, now that our friend Sabeel is there, I'm sure that they will fix everything. But I do think that the regulatory state and the administrative state is a really big place where a lot of decision making gets done. And I think part of putting those hooks and levers into those kinds of decisions will be essential. And then somehow showcasing back to people where their voice mattered and where they were able to sort of move the ball and where they weren't and why they weren't, right? That's kind of another part of this, is sort of being honest with people about what's possible and what's not, and then trying to really empower people where you can.
Very briefly, to either of you or both of you, Christopher Taylor asked a series of questions about crowdsourcing and use of technology to really make engagement more equitable and accessible and scalable. Yes, no, optimistic about new uses of technology in this space?
So my general approach is that, like, I don't fetishize technology or sort of think about technology as its own thing. It's like we as people in society are constantly using the most current and up-to-date technology in order to organize ourselves. And, like, it was a major innovation during the civil rights movement that they were able to produce, using the mimeograph machines, the flyers at the rate that they were able to produce them. Now we use Twitter, but Twitter, the technology isn't the root. The root still comes back down to our ideas, our vision, and our relationships through organizing. So I think organizers and folks in community will continue to leverage technology, continue to leverage new and accessible forms of technology in order to get their word across, in order to organize each other. And I think that it's technology is politically neutral and in the hands of people who are interested in broad-based democracy. It's a good thing. The other thing I would say is that we need tools that are open source, tools that aren't owned by individuals. Like Facebook is owned by and controlled by one individual. And that should be a concern that is, to me, a concerning feature of our democracy. So many of us, my mom, my family around the world, and my friends around the world use Facebook in order to communicate and to get their news. And it's up to the algorithms that aren't in any way regulated by any of us, that billions of people around the world form their ideas, their political ideas, their connection to their societies. And I think we need open source forms of technology to do those things.
In the interest of time, I'm going to bring in Laura Miner asks a couple of questions, and both of you are parents, and she asks about the role of parents, and you mentioned your mom, so it triggers it for me. The role here of education. So there are a lot of questions about how do we create more responsive, more listening institutions, but if institutions are listening, somebody has to be speaking up. More people are speaking up than ever before, but is there something we need to be doing differently as parents or as educators to enable the future that you're working towards? Holly,
I'm deferring
you've got
to
two kids. She has two kids. You have
I only
one,
have
so
one.
she
You have
trumps
two,
here,
so
right?
I think you're.
Well, she'll take this question.
Child during COVID, and my mom is on the Zoom, so I guess it's all coming to me. I mean, look, I think I'm just going to use my own, like, just my personal self. Like, I'm very focused on, making a multiracial democracy happen. And so we try to model that in our own home. And that's kind of something that we just do. And I think it's important for sort of exposing children. Again, I'm not like a parenting expert. I don't know. I'm just, we just try to expose our children to a lot of different cultures, a lot of different viewpoints, a lot of different things, so that they're constantly seeing people who don't look like them in their books and the way they engage. And, that's but our kids are so young. I have 2 under 2. So I feel like that's kind of what I know.
I would say that during the uprisings, I was so heartened by my child is 4.5, and I was so heartened by how very young people took to the movement, including my child. so I think sometimes we think that these concepts might be either not age appropriate or over their head or whatever, but I would encourage parents to, just involve your children, even very young children, in these conversations around democracy, around racism, sexism, homophobia, around the challenging oppression, around what a multiracial democracy might look like, and why that's important. My child took to it, and I've seen many other very, very young children, as well as like older children, really take to these ideas.
Well, on that note, I'm going to ask you each in 30 seconds I think the most important thing we can do for kids is to give them a hopeful vision for the future, especially in contrast to the rather dismal present that we've been living in for the last many months. What is your vision for where the world is 5 years, 10 years, a generation from now?
Sure, I'll go first in 30 seconds. Our charge is to build a multiracial working class alignment of people across urban, rural, and suburban communities in this country that are in conversation and in solidarity with the international movement to create a more democratic world where like our global society and our global economy is in the interest of working people, in the interest of its population. And we have a great opportunity and project, which is the Global Climate Project that we all could work on as a very current and urgent reason to build that multiracial working class alliance, both in this country and around the world.
Holly?
I have to go now. That was so good. I also think, when I look into the future, I'm hopeful for sort of a multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy that shows that we can tackle some of these big questions and we can do it in a thoughtful, responsive, participatory way, whether it's racial justice, climate justice, health disparities. I think I want us to show that like we can solve really big problems and have kind of an ambitious agenda that, we felt like we could really tackle these big things and do it in a really thoughtful way.
Well, I know I speak for everybody who's listening, whether live in the room or on social media, that this was just the beginning of a wonderful conversation that we could easily do for many more hours. But I want to thank you so, so much for being generous with your time. I know both of you are extraordinarily busy fighting the good fight and parenting, which may or may not be the same thing. So I want to encourage people who would like more of you to follow you both on Twitter, to get the book Civic Power, to sign up for and join Working Families, and to follow both of your good works. For people who would like to join us for our next conversation, if you want to talk about depressing, we're going to talk about the state of Congress next time, and how we can actually realize a better and different future for Congress with Kevin Kosar, who actually some of you may be interested in the fact that he's a fellow at AEI. And for those of you who are not interested in that fact, you'll be more interested in the fact that Kevin is actually also the author of the Whiskey, A Global History. So if you don't want to come to hear about Congress and instead you want to hear about whiskey, or in order to hear about Congress, you need to have some whiskey, come and join us for Kevin Kosar in one of our upcoming talks. Thank you to everybody, and apologies to the many people whose questions we didn't get to today. Since our speakers are parents first and activists second, we are letting them off the hook for virtual wine and cheese today, and going to wrap up our chat with you. But thank you so, so much for this inspiring discussion about the lodestar to which we all need to work. And there's much work to be done. So thank you to both of you. Thanks to everybody for joining us. And thank you to the Institute for Public Knowledge. And we will see you for the Kevin Kosar event coming up. Thank you so much, everybody. Take care.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Thanks.